So it is my pleasure to introduce Kendra Levine, a person who I've known for a long time in previous roles of mine before I even lived in California. One of the very sweet people who sent me an email when it was first announced I was coming out here and said, hey, you're in California, that's pretty cool. We used to go to transportation camp together in DC. I think that's how we know each other best. Kendra is super involved with or has been involved with Transportation Research Board in the past, I think perhaps continuing to, for now at least. And the reason that we asked Kendra to come, it's great that we're doing our usual recordings and whatnot, but this is a seminar that is very much for you guys to understand as grad students some of the resources that are available to you. Kendra is the senior, director, the Transportation Library Director. She sits at ITS Berkeley, but she is part of all of the ITSs. So all of the Institute of Transportation Studies. Kendra is your librarian to help you with many of those functions. And I think you're going to hear more about all of those in a minute. So I could read from the bio, but I think I'll let Kendra do it. And as usual, I had to ask because the bio doesn't say it, but Kendra has a master's in both library sciences and what was this?
Information systems.
And information systems from Drexel. So for the more East Coast based folks in the room, you might appreciate that. So I will give it away. Thank you, Kendra. Thanks
for coming out on a Friday afternoon. At Berkeley, we also have seminars on Friday afternoons. It's always sort of this, why are we making people come to campus on a Friday afternoon? It's a great time to be in community. So I'm the library director and librarian at ITS for UC ITS at the ITS library at UC Berkeley. It's convoluted. It has a lot to do with history. And we'll talk a little bit about history coming up. So today we're going to talk about how to find what you're looking for and sort of I'm presenting like a little theoretical, but just more of like, think about every time you start your research, here's some things to consider to help you be more efficient or, actually figure out if the question you're asking, if you can actually find an answer for or find the research you want. So the overview today, we'll do a very brief history of transportation, research and information, very brief. I know you can read books about that if you want, and you can find them in the library. We're also gonna have a discussion of transportation information and data, like different types that you might be looking for and how what different types of information and formats sort of inform how you're going to look for them or different strategies. We're gonna have a little bit of power analysis. Are folks familiar with the concept of power analysis? Okay, you're gonna learn something new. It's very plannery, I've come to understand. And then we'll end with some actual practical, like once you have this whole framework, how to actually, places to actually do your searching. So there will be some practical advice at the end. I always like to start with who I am, talking about myself, to sort of center my positionality. I think it's always good to sort of think about you as you go through any situation, all of your experience and expertise and how they sort of inform each other. So for me, I'm a transportation librarian for UC ITS. I'm based at UC Berkeley. So I serve the whole state. I really care about everything California related, but I am, of course, at UC Berkeley physically, although I do get around, and thanks to Zoom, it's much easier to collaborate with people around the state. I am currently the chair of the TRB Information and Knowledge Management Committee. You probably did not know such a committee existed. Well, there's a whole section of TRB all about executive management issues, and that is one of the committees in that section. And so I've been involved with TRB my entire career. So I know a lot about how transportation research in the TRB space works. And if you have no idea what we're talking about yet, you probably will someday because it's very important. And there's a lot of money that goes there. I'm also the chief negotiator for UCFT librarians. So UC librarians across all 10 campuses who are represented by union or represented by UCFT. And I am the chief negotiator for their contract. We ratified the contract in October. And so that was a big thing. And so I have a different relationship with the university because of that, because I've worked through, like, I worked with the university in terms of contract negotiations and enforcement. And so I have, that informs how I understand how this campus or any campus works. And I also know how all 10 campuses work, which is kind of unique. I'm a member of the Special Libraries Association, which is actually about to fold, and the American Libraries Association. I'm very involved in the library world. So like, I'm a transportation person and a librarian. And I'm also the Safe Routes to Schools champion for my kids' school. We won the Golden Sneaker Contest, or actually the Platinum Sneaker Contest last year. If you don't know what that is, it's neat, but it's also, I think, one thing that a lot of transportation folks, I think a lot of researchers and practitioners in general, there's this tension between being an activist or bringing your practice to your communities in the real world. And sometimes, especially in research, you're supposed to be objective, but it's hard when all the research points to a certain way. And so my involvement in getting involved in the Safe Routes to School stuff was really just sort of like, oh, I support researchers doing all this bike ped safety research. Why aren't we doing this in my city? So now I'm bringing that research to bear in the public. And there's lots of other stuff that informs our work. So that's a little bit about me, and hopefully that will sort of help frame everything we're going to talk about. Yeah, and there I'm riding a bike without a helmet. I know you're not supposed to, but it's on a side street, and I don't know.
We're in Davis, we do that too.
Yeah, you know the risks. All right, so transportation history. I think it's important to remember that transportation as we know it today is pretty modern, especially like if you think about how everything has really, evolved in the last 20 years. It was like, it keeps evolving, but at the same time, not that much. So this is a picture, actually from J Street in Sacramento in 1923. So it's about 100 years ago. This is J and 11th. It looks very different, but not that different from if you were hanging out on J Street in Sacramento today, probably. I mean, there are no street, well, actually, no, Sac has RT, but like a lot of what we think of as transportation really came into about 100 years ago, when traffic engineering as we know it was really becoming codified, and cars, the choice was made to really prioritize driving and personal automobiles over other modes. And so the reason I frame it that way is because everything can change. Like, this is like where we're at today is a reflection of a ton of policy choices and investments. And the research that we've done is a reflection of that. So that's sort of informs, like, when you go back and do research, or you're looking for stuff, what's there and what's not there, reflects a bunch of choices, or is the result of a bunch of choices that happened 100 years ago. And I think that it's also good to think about how the systems that we have now were also a reaction to what was happening at the time, or what was happening then. Something that I think is really important, or I always keep in the back of my mind, again, I'm a California history nerd to some degree because I grew up in Sacramento, and I think it's hard not to grow up in Sacramento and not know a lot about California history, because that's all Sacramento has. Sacramento has a lot of stuff now, but in the 80s it did not have much besides museums and state parks. Is that before, like, why were people so excited about personal automobiles? One big reason was it broke up the rail monopolies. And that, back, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, if you wanted to move goods, you had to go through, like, you would have to pay the rail companies. And, Southern Pacific in California, Santa Fe, all these, they're still around. They really made it hard for people to get anywhere and to get goods from the farms or get from the factories to market. And so that was something highways really democratized access to markets. But in some ways only too far. So, but that was part of the original allure of highways, was not just the freedom and all of those messages that we still have, but there was a real practical one of, making it easier for people to get stuff to market, to make money without having to pay the rail barons. And that's also shaped by market forces. Peter Norton, who is a historian at University of Virginia. Yes, I know he's Virginia School, but it's UVA. He does a lot of research around this. And he has Fighting Traffic, I think is a really great book by him that talks about this. And you know, he has another book that's coming out soon, or he's clearly researching another book that sort of goes back to like the history of transportation as we know it was driven a lot by investment choices and by lobbying from certain groups like automakers, oil companies, road builders. I feel like automakers and oil companies very obvious, road builders probably not so much. So then we get into the early transportation research history. So a lot of it is very practical, really focused on how to build roads and how to, and you see this sort of the emergence of like the two sides of transportation. One is the actual civil engineering part of how do you build roads? How do you get people and goods from places in a sort of abstract way? And the other side is commerce. If you think about it, USDOT, as we know it today, grew out of the Department of Commerce. It did not grow out of like the Army Corps of Engineers. On the flip side of that, state departments of transportation did grow out of Public Works. In California, the Division of Highways, as it was called, was part of the Department of Public Works before it eventually split off and became Caltrans, where it was the Division of Highways and then it became Caltrans in 1974. And actually around the 1970s, the mid-70s, a lot of things changed as the approach. But I think that that's like a real thing. This picture here is Dr. Miller McClintock, who has anyone heard this name, Miller McClintock, before? Okay, he was a researcher with the Albert Eskin Traffic Safety Research Center at Harvard. It was actually at UCLA for a brief minute, or what was to become UCLA for a brief minute in the 20s, but then it moved to Harvard. Albert Russell Erskine was the CEO of Studebaker, and he created this research center, Street Traffic Research Center. Miller McClintock is sort of the first person who did research or wrote about traffic engineering as we know it and traffic control. And a lot of it was because of safety, because, you know, intersections and traffic was chaotic at, 100 years ago. You had cars, sometimes you still had horses, you had streetcars, you had early buses, you had people on bikes, you had people walking, and there was no sense of control. And so McClintock started his research about how to make the streets safer, but in a way that really was focused on automobile throughput. And so a lot of the assumptions we have about traffic engineering today started with him. And it's kind of neat to be able to go back and look at that and say like, here's the guy who started it. Yeah, there's also the Transportation Research Board, which started in 1920 as the National Advisory Board on Highway Research. It was renamed to TRB in 1974. And that was part of national academies. And if you're ever involved with it, they'll talk about how it's this federally funded but independent organization that is about research. And it does advise the federal government and states about the best way to apply research. One of the things that's really interesting about the history of TRB is that the need to provide access to information, like, basically started from the beginning. They understood that part of the way to have better research and better better transportation projects was for people to actually know what's going on. And so the Highway Research Information Service, or HRIS, started sometime in the 30s and it's still going on today. And we'll talk about what it eventually evolved into. And so I think though, that I want to take this other step back to sort of just look at TRB for a minute. So in 1930, there were 6 different topic sections in TRB. And this sort of gives you an overview of what was considered transportation 100 years ago, more or less. So administration and finance, like how agencies operate and function. Transportation, very broad. I'm assuming they mean surface transportation, because I guess maritime also existed, but we didn't really have civil aviation at this point, so to speak. Highway design, they're actually talking about the geometry and the building, not just the geometry and like the placement of highways. Materials and construction, that's where you get to road building. Maintenance, how do you maintain these roads? And traffic, which is analysis, regulation, and safety. That's kind of vague and kind of broad. And using today's lens, like you would think, like, what are these? How is this meaningless? As opposed to today, and this is after a major restructuring that TRB did in 2023, where they actually shrank and collapsed some sections. There are 18 sections, 10 groups, which are 10 groups outside of the sections and 5 different councils to cover different, the councils sort of cover broad topic areas like international transportation outside the US, urban issues, tribal issues, those are all councils. But here, you can see, like, now we actually have pedestrians, bicycles, and human factors. That's in the safety group, actually, along with operations, and safety is separate. Data and data science is a whole new field that did not exist in the 1930s, really. Yeah, so I feel like it's harder to stay on top of things. So that's part of one of the things to think about as you're doing your research. There's so many different ways that people are answering the same question, and that is a barrier. So then the other thing is to think about with research, and going back to the history, and this is the history has informed to where we are now. It's a mix of government funded research and government conducted research. There's industry, and industry could be anything from like auto manufacturers and OEMs, as well as consultants. And there's a real symbiosis between, or the ecosystem has a lot of work between government agencies, consulting firms, and academics. And sometimes people wear all 3 hats simultaneously, or like enmeshed in all of those, and understanding that can be really messy to untangle. Transportation agencies, again, as I said earlier, they grew out of both commerce and public works, and it sort of depends. And this is one of the things where I was helping someone with a research question earlier this week. And I was like, you should look at org charts. And he's like, why should, like, org charts? Like, I just need to talk to the people. I'm like, no, it's always good to figure out where they fit in the org chart, because then you understand what's the goal of having that department exist, or have a better idea of that. And I've seen this with like transportation libraries. Sometimes state DOTs will have their library fit under the construction division, because the library is there to help people build the pavement. And that's, DOTs are basically construction companies. We'll talk about that probably later. But sometimes they'll be under the business side. And so it's more about the market research and like making sure you're doing investments. So I always say, look at org charts. University research centers, as they started springing up in the 30s and 40s, more like the 40s is when you start really seeing them spring up after World War II. They're to inform states to make sure that as states were going to be spending a lot of money to build highways and build infrastructure, that they were doing it wisely. And so that's when, ITS, which now is UC ITS, it originally started in a piece of California legislation in 1947, where the state was like, we're gonna build all these highways. We should actually make sure we're doing it scientifically correct, that we have like planning and research underpinning this. So they started the Institute of Transportation Traffic Engineering. So that's what ITTE stood for. And it was based at UC Berkeley, and it worked really closely with the state. Other schools and states built similar models. Purdue had their road school, and actually there was really a strong relationship between the two. And eventually in 1973, ITTE rebranded as ITS, recognizing that transportation is not just traffic engineering. And so that's when the rebrand happened. But yeah, I think that that's like pretty common overall. But I think the large focus has always been engineering. So if you're not interested in engineering, traditional engineering, it sort of goes by the wayside. And that's something that I think is interesting, like looking at the history of ITS. The biggest focus on ITS in the original days, which we sort of forgot about, was geotechnical engineering and soils. Does anyone have an idea why that might have been the case? Because that's like foundational, literally, to road building. And that's what Berkeley was really known for, road building and asphalt pavements. And actually, there were 3 professors who I guess sort of created the world of asphalt paving as we know it today. And one of them was Carl Monismith, who was at Berkeley until recently he passed away this summer. But UCPRC, which is here at Davis, sort of grew out of that, Monismith's work. So yeah, anyway, road building is great. I don't want people to think I'm against road building. It's just like, that's where all the focus is. Okay, so why does this matter? And I think the reason I'm framing all this is because I think it matters because I want you to think about what gets funded and what gets shared. And how it gets funded and how it sort of dictates how it gets shared. And then it also talks about the intended audience. So is the intended audience academics? Like, are you writing a journal article for other academics to consume primarily? Is that your main focus? That's gonna then you're gonna go to an academic journal. It's gonna be written differently than if you're writing a tech report that's meant to be handed to a practitioner working in the field, you know? Or if you're writing grade, that's gonna be grade literature. There's this weird, in transportation, there is also this like sort of weird, I don't wanna say nether space, but I don't see it in a lot of other disciplines where you have more professional literature. So it'd be like a paper presented at an ITE conference. Even a paper presented at TRB or some of the stuff that's at the Transportation Research Board annual meeting is not quite as academic as something that might be presented at another conference, or like APTA is another, like there are all these like sort of not quasi, they're professional associations, but a lot of academics are involved in it because a lot of transportation research is applied. You are going to get it into the field. And then there's also a lot of popular media, like news articles. And that's really important too, because you need to get the information out there to the public. And so I think it's also important to think about timescales. This happens a lot with research, with researchers coming up with an idea. They're like, oh, I heard about this project that's happening. Where can I find more? It's like, well, that project was just announced. It's still in the planning phase. Like there's nothing published about it. Or, oh, that's a really cool project. It just finished. They're still doing the evaluation, you know? Like you might have some data, you might not. So thinking about the timescales in terms of when like of a project being announced, like if it's a city, it's probably gonna take longer to get information out than some of the states because they don't have as many resources. Or, you know, how far down the line has this been something that's been going on for a very long time and is like actually closer to being like, you know, shovel ready versus not? Like that informs it. And so especially if you're working on like a term project, I might say pick a different project or think of something else that you actually can find the information for. And then I think it's also important to think about like for like finding about academic research, like, you know, how like if it's still in publication, like how long is it going to be take to get published? And I'll talk more about the timescale for publishing. Academic publishing is very slow. Be prepared for that if you're ever going that route. It's frustrating. And then for data, how long does it take for the data to be made available, if it's ever going to be available? That's another big thing, especially as we rely a lot on vendor data now, a lot of transportation projects. So that data will never be publicly available, or you might have to sign an NDA, or you're gonna have to like get a data use agreement. And that's a huge obstacle for research. All right, so academic publications, you're probably gonna be really familiar with all of these, or they're what you mostly think, like journal articles, transportation research series, like that's the cornerstone of transportation, all certain areas of transportation. Conference papers from a lot of, you know, big conferences, book chapters also count. I would say the intended audience is other academics. I mean, there are also like people, general public people do read them, but a lot of people don't have access to them because they tend to be behind paywalls, unless you're publishing them open access. But even then, the language tends to be not accessible to the general public. But that's okay, because the audience is really other academics. And some of it is a reflection of the need for, you know, faculty and grad students to publish, to get jobs and to get tenure, which is a whole other thing we're not touching on, but it is something we have to contend with in finding information. So you really depend on libraries being able to subscribe to journal packages. If it's with a big publisher, the library probably pays a lot of money. I know UC Davis pays a lot of money for you to have access to journals, so you should use them. And you might be using them and you don't know, which is probably the case. Or if they're doing open access articles, you have to pay an article processing charge for a lot of journals, and that's money. They like might be there are a few journals where it's like a couple $100 or like maybe $500. Some journals will go up to $10,000. For transportation, it's usually around $3,000.
Do you have other things about open access, or could you touch on for these guys sort of the transition that the UCs are making to paying for us as academics to have open access instead of paying
Yeah.
for access to the journal?
So UC has a number of what they call transformative agreements. And it's the open access mandate. Well, so there was an open access mandate in 2013, which followed a White House open access memo. I can go a whole history, but it doesn't matter about that. So the transformative agreements are with different publishers have different agreements. And if you want, I can send you the link. I'm developing like a handy guide about like, here's your rights. And there are also librarians here who can help navigate that for Davis specific. But I think everything at Davis is actually just UC wide. So like Elsevier, the idea though is that if your research doesn't have the funds, if you don't have the funds to cover the full APC, for some publishers, UC has a deal where the libraries will cover the APC, the article processing charge for you. But they ask that you try to budget for that. UCITS or the SB1 funded research from UCITS, it's encouraged for you to budget for the APC, but if you're publishing in an Elsevier journal, that one will definitely be fully covered by the library. And that is part of the agreement that we have with Elsevier. So that would be the transportation.
And we even get a discount off of the fees that they otherwise would
Yes.
charge because of those agreements and such.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is once we negotiate the agreement with them, they raise the prices. So Nature, they immediately raise the price, and we don't have the agreement for Nature journals. It's just a discount, not covering fees. Yeah. But I'm happy, I believe everything should be open access. The other great thing is all UC research can go into the eScholarship, which is a free repository. And it was designed to have people put their preprints in. There's so much confusing language around that, but again, I'm more than happy to help people walk through that. I know UC Davis ITS has a very robust eScholarship repository, partially because I really helped Seth and Lauren get that going. And we help maintain that to it from the library because we really believe in getting that research out there and accessible. Professional publications, sort of the same as academic, except for it's more industry-based conferences. The timescales tend to be a little bit quicker. Because academic publications, it can take any time from 3 months to 18 plus months to 2 years to get a journal article accepted, which is really frustrating if you're trying to close out a project and you can't because it's in editorial purgatory. But part of the reason it's also doing that is because they don't pay editors. And so most of the people like editing or like doing the peer review for your journals, they're not getting paid. It's all volunteer work, or you're expected to do it as service. It's a really dysfunctional mess. I hope it's clear. I don't really like it. But for professional societies, they tend to be a little bit quicker and they tend to have like a shorter time scale. But their stuff tends to also be more ephemeral. You can't necessarily like ITE conference papers, we used to be able to buy CDs of them. We actually used to be able to buy the physical compendium of papers. Nowadays, they just like get posted and then they disappear. And so people might like talk about this paper you saw at ITE and it's like, oh, they don't really do conference proceedings anymore. Same thing with APTA, or that it's like only locked down to members and there isn't a way for people to really get a library-wide license for that. Same thing, I love ITE, but I really hate that they make it very difficult to get their handbooks to students in a reasonable way for libraries. But also the other thing, practitioners usually don't have time to write conference papers and journal articles, and that's not really part of their job. Like, and sometimes it is part of their job, but it's not the same, it's not their job the way it is for academics. Like, you're expected to publish. And if you tell people like, oh, I'm gonna write a journal article as well as this report, they're like, yeah, you have to. Where practitioners say, oh, that's really nice. You still need to like finish all the other stuff. gray literature is a huge part of transportation research, and it's really hard to search for and find. And so we're talking about technical reports, like everything Caltrans publishes is gray literature. Agency memos, other types of research reports, like if LA Metro does a study on like Sepulveda bus lanes or something, just making something up, that will probably be some report that LA Metro will put on their website. It may or may not get picked up by another database, or you might have to actually just go to the LA Metro site to find it. The audience is mostly practitioners, but they know academics are reading it. They know the policy makers are going to be reading it. Also the public. It's part of that public accountability that they have to show their work. Those projects can take months or years. It depends on like the scope of it. And the links break all the time because agencies break their websites, and then it's what we call link rot. And they're not usually peer reviewed either. That's actually a bigger issue, I think, for a lot of think tanks or like NGOs will put out these reports and they look really good, but they're not peer reviewed, which is fine. It's not saying peer review is great, because peer review can also break down. But sometimes you're like, oh, this looks like a legit report, and you're like, oh, actually, this is just like not exactly made up, but it's clearly just an advocacy paper that is trying to come off as more scientific than not. So you should always be critical of all your sources. And then popular media, like this is, you know, free for all, but there's sometimes like really useful stuff. Like I think Streets blog actually does some really good reporting out there, and they will highlight stories and research that you might not be able to find easily otherwise. But the thing I've noticed around that is we're seeing a big move to newsletters and these like subscription news sites, like the information that we don't have access to and we can't mix. They're like a new type of paywall, but there's ways around potentially. Anyway, and those some memes are community conversation piece. Like this meme of the parking minimums and parking maximums. I mean, it's a way to actually like distill concepts in a very digestible way. Dr. Tara Goddard at Texas A&M, I think she actually in her classes like has assignments where her students have to make memes based off of the concepts they're learning in class, which is a good way. Yeah, on the second, I don't know why I saved this to my phone, but I did. Maybe because I don't know. Does anyone bike in Sacramento?
Yeah.
It's kind of wild at parts. At least driving anyway. So let's also talk a little bit about data. So the thing with transportation data is that it's everywhere and it's everything. And it's kind of frustrating. I think a lot of times when people think transportation data, they're like, it depends on who you're talking to, but I think a lot of people think highway data. We're really lucky in California. We have PEMS, the PEMS database from Caltrans and INRIX, I think. They started out of PATH at UC Berkeley. And that just gives you highway like status for the entire state. Very few places have that publicly available. But their surveys are also really important. AVL data, I know is like a really big one. GTFS for transit, like, and Caltrans is doing a lot of stuff to really improve that in California with their statewide. They haven't launched it yet, have they?
Yeah, I think not quite yet.
But they're so close.
Yeah.
But then we're also talking about like environmental data and other economic indicators like labor, like what's the workforce like? There's a lot of focus right now on workforce development and who the workforce is and different. And that was like a big thing with the transit operator shortage lately. And what was the data around that? It's gonna come from different sources. So it's not just transportation. This is all like transportation is everything and everything is transportation, I guess is the thing. The intended audience can be agencies, it can be researchers, it can be policymakers, it can be developers, like app developers, but it can also be like, you know, real estate developers and the general public. And then sometimes like data sets can be very small and they can take minutes to generate, or they can be huge data programs like the census, and we don't really know what's going on, or the NRDP, or whatever the Cat Labs big data set and PRMS, yes, which is like a huge national data set of traffic and arterial traffic data, which is actually using probe vehicle data and state highway data from the HPMS, which is the Highway Performance Monitoring System. which is a federal data set. Big obstacles with this, data programs are expensive and this government agencies are using more private vendors for data programs than ever before. And so they used to collect their own data and now they're just buying it from here or TomTom or Inrix, which means the public doesn't have access to it anymore. And we don't have the infrastructure for it. So now we're also getting synthetic data, which can be kind of messy. There's a lot of privacy issues. I think that's a huge one. And privacy issues in terms of getting access to the data, because there might be personal identifiable information in there, but also privacy issues in that this was a big thing with the mobility data standard that was happening around scooters. They didn't want to share the data. They didn't want to have a standard because companies didn't want other people to know what data was being collected because they thought it was going to give them a commercial advantage. And that's a real thing that we have to think about in terms of data. And also the ephemeral nature of data. People will throw stuff up on GitHub and then it might be gone like the next week. Or you might just find, like I have this data set, I want to clean up of Berkeley bike counts. And it is literally just a like misformatted, copy pasted spreadsheet of bike counts in Berkeley for the last 20 years. It's great, but it's totally unusable in its current form. So provenance is important. All right. So then moving on to talk about transportation terminology. So this is like all sort of like leading into like how we talk about stuff, which I think is important again, because most of searching is done by, by words. And so you want to make sure, like, especially if you're doing searching on a computer, you want to make sure you're using the right terminology. And so the thing is that it continues to evolve. And so sometimes if you're looking for a concept from, like, if you're looking for like FTA reports from the 1960s, you can't because the Federal Transit Administration didn't exist in the 1960s. Back then it was UMTA, which was Urban Metropolitan Transportation Authority or something like agency. I just know it's UMTA. And it's like, who would call, like, you wouldn't know that. But if you didn't know that UMTA was where the reports were, you would hit a dead end at some point. There's also the accepted terminology might not be the best way to describe something, but it's what is used. And that sometimes in some fields, terms are going to be misapplied according to another field, but that's what the field's calling it. And so you sort of have to recognize like, oh, if I am talking about, this is really travel behavior, but someone might say mode choice. They're similar concepts, but they're not the same. We see this a lot when we talk about algorithms and mathematical models, because I think a lot of people don't know really what an algorithm is. And so they'll just use the term algorithm and it's like, oh, that's not really, you just did a search. Like that's not quite. And then, yeah. So I think that it's always important to think about what fields might be, what field are you talking like in, and what fields might also be doing the research around that. So like, are you butting up against policy? Is it environmental? Because, when you're doing your research, because you need to figure out what they call it, or they might be using the same terms, in which case that's really handy. So here's some definitive language. The first one, I think we're mostly there. People still say accident in some areas, but right now, in the state of California in 2021 officially adopted it, or Caltrans had a memo that said, yes, everything is now crash, collision, or incident, not accident. You can read No Accidents by Jesse Singer, which is a really good book that sort of gives the history of the move to crash and not accident and why we don't say accident. Because especially in traffic safety, everything is foreseeable. Like crashes and collisions happen because of a series of choices that created the environment for them to happen. Another one is IBHS. Has anyone ever seen that term before?
I know I'm old. Older than everyone in the room. It's okay. I've come to accept it.
No, let's see. So like IBHS was the Intelligent Vehicle and Highway Systems. This was intelligent transportation was back in the 80s and 90s. Everything was IBHS. Highways were going to talk to each other. Like cars could talk to highways. Now everyone's just like, and then in the early 2000s, it was ITS, Intelligent Transportation Systems. And that was really exciting. I remember when I first started working, I was like, yeah, everything's like intelligent transportation systems that had a computer, it's ITS. But then you get that point, you're like, everything is intelligent now. sort of like there was a moment where everything was smart, like we don't talk about smart parking anymore, but that was revolutionary at the time. Instead now we talk about like connected vehicles, autonomous, well, it's funny, because there used to be vehicle to infrastructure communication, vehicle to vehicle communication. Now it's just V2X. It's like, can vehicles talk to anything? And so it's like, okay, and that's gonna continue to evolve. So you just
So
have
it's AI.
AI.
If there's a computer involved at all, it's AI.
Oh, yeah, no, yeah. Like, is intelligent gonna mean something else now? I don't know. But these are things you have to think about, especially if you're talking about like the history of stuff. It's like, oh, yeah. Like in some ways, connected vehicles are very current and new, but at the same time, like we were experimenting with some weird connected vehicle technology back in the 60s. Like they had vehicles, like cars that could literally connect to the highway and have them be guided through like a track. Weird. But then there's also imprecise language. So accessibility is one that I think is a pretty common one. So are you talking about like how accessible an area is to get to by different modes of transportation? Are you talking about if it's accessible for people with disabilities? Both are correct. You have to think about the terminology. Scooters is another one that I think like well, I'll talk a little bit more about the scooter debate, but I think rideshare is like a really common one that is really imprecise too. Because I think people still talk about rideshare when they're talking about like Uber and Lyft. And only real policy wonks will say transportation network company or TNC. That's not a term that like, or actually, how many people have ever heard ride hailing or ride sourcing? Okay, that's great. That was part of the SAE, there's the SAE shared mobility standard, which that's where that was codified in that work, that Susan Shaheen is leading it. But that hasn't really filtered into the common parlance, and so you'll find people talking about rideshare. They're not transportation people, and it's like, don't call it that, but it's okay, it's okay. So the SAE standard for shared mobility, that's a controlled vocabulary, and controlled vocabularies are really good. Here's a definition from a person, Patricia Harping, who wrote a book about controlled vocabularies or defined it. An organized arrangement of words, phrases used to index content or retrieve content through browsing and searching. This is really common for like, I think like anytime you go to a like website to buy stuff and you can like Amazon has a huge taxonomy that says like, oh, shoes, what type of shoes, you know, like they sort of like band the shoes together. They're often coordinated by a group or some sort of authority to sort of say, yes, these are how we're going to define these words, or this is how the words will be used. These are the words we're including. They tend to be very subject focused because that's part of it. You can't have a controlled vocabulary that's everything. They're usually focused on some kind of application. Because the purpose is to really help make it easy for people to find and describe what's around there. And they're inherently political because they're a reflection of what that organization deems important to talk about. And then I think this is actually something that's happened, and right now it's really hard, especially for me as a librarian, to ignore this. There's been a lot of work in the library world to improve the Library of Congress subject headings, or LCSH. Those are the terms that you'll find in the library catalog of how we describe things, and they were using those to remove books at US military libraries. And so the person who wrote this blog post, Fox, they're a cataloger who was really instrumental and involved in getting a bunch of new terms added in the last 5 years. And unfortunately, all the terms that they worked on were now being used to weed books out of a collection, which is, you know, the reality of the moment. So TRV has a controlled vocabulary, which is the Transportation Research Thesaurus. If you've never heard of it before, you are like most people in this world. It started as part of an NCHRP project in 1997 because they realized they needed some sort of way to help organize transportation research. It's used to index things in TRID, and I'll talk more about TRID in a little bit. And so the design was to describe transportation research. It's managed by the TRV Information Services team. and there's a committee of librarians from around the world who sit on and advise them on how to, add terms. And, I'm on that committee, so like, I've had big arguments with people about how do you define a scooter? Cause are you talking about like the small, like moped type scooters, or are you talking about scooters that you stand on? And then what if it's like a scooter like that, but there's a seat? Is that the same thing? And so some of it is like balancing like usage, like what's the actual, like, we don't wanna add all the terms, cause like that's gonna become unwieldy for users, but at the same time, you wanna be what's right. And so we try to be, my approach to it is always like, if it's like, I'm not gonna, I'm going to defer to experts, but my area of expertise is very much like micromobility and active transportation, because that's something that we do in California that a lot of other people are not as involved in. And so anytime you see like a new bike term or whatever, it's because I fought for it really hard. It is very DOT biased though, too. And if you look at the way it was made, like was mostly road construction. We were working to undo, and we are working to like update it to be more true to like transportation as today, but it's a slow progress. But you can also add terms if there's not a term, if there's a term that you find missing, if you're searching for stuff, you can suggest it, and then we can, the committee will evaluate it. All right. And so there's a bit of a power analysis real quick as we go to the other terms. So when I talk about power analysis, it's the concept of like sort of going through and figuring out like who has power in any situation, and where, like, which sort of informs like how you might navigate that situation. I think in planning, it's a pretty common concept, because you're just like, okay, we're gonna be, trying to build a bike lane, like how many agencies are involved? Or the thing I always like to talk about in terms of power analysis is like, what if you want to put a public electric vehicle charger in the parking strip in front of your house? Who has jurisdiction over that? Is it the homeowner? Maybe. Does the city, like when does the city have to come in? Like, how much do you have to involve the public utilities? What if it's a parking strip in front of a shopping center? Like, who has jurisdiction over that? And it depends on the city, and like sort of mapping out like who you can influence and all of that. For research, I think it's important. It can be really useful to do that, to sort of think about who created this and all that. So who might have written on this topic, and do they have the means to publish it? One thing that's really frustrating about academic publishing is that it's extremely labor intensive, and a lot of people don't have the means to get into the journals, either because they can't pay the APCs. Some journals are actually also starting to move in terms of like, you have to pay to submit model, which is really inequitable. Like, grad students can't afford that for the most part, unless their research projects have funding for it. But a lot of research projects won't let you put that in the, like, there's not a line item, or like it's a weird type of cost that it's hard to budget for. People from low and middle income countries can't afford that. And so there's a lot of research that just isn't being, might not be getting out there. But also people who might be doing really good research that aren't part of a formal institution, like community-based organizations, like, they have information and knowledge that it's harder to publish. So that's one of those questions. I also think it's important to think which venues that research or that information might be shared in. So is it gonna be a government report? Is it gonna be a memo? Is it gonna show up in like city council minutes? Like, is it some community like message board or something? Like, all of those could be information sources you might need to use for your research, but like that means it's gonna have like a different layer of abstraction and complication potentially. And then for data, it's always a question of who's responsible for it. Are they gonna share it? Can it be publicly available? Because sometimes, yeah. And I think that this is one of the things that I've noticed, just like from my own experience. As I mentioned, the PEMS data in California, there are a lot of people all around the world doing research about California highways just because the data is so freely available. Which is also why if you can publish data, it's really good, because one, you might get credit for it, because it's you can publish it in a way that you'll get cited, and you can count those citations to things, but also that means that like more people are gonna be able to work on answering questions. That's really great, rather than just like reporting data, and we're seeing, I think that there's a real issue on that. But that's a whole separate soapbox I'm not going to engage in right now. So some things I think it's always good to consider before you start searching, who creates and curates. Like remembering language is power, and so like you might want to either, are you using the language of the people in power or like the agencies who are sort of dictating it? Like in the US, mobility on demand was the term, yes. Sometimes the US DOT will come up with a phrase for something that only the US DOT uses, but in the US, everything's gonna be sort of fall from that. And so mobility as a service is the term that was used for shared mobility outside the US. Mobility on demand is what the US picked. And I was in many contentious TRT meetings where they were trying to get us to adopt mobility on demand as a subject, and we're like, no, because that's a US DOT specific thing. The TRT is meant to be international, like international enough, I guess, where it's not supposed to be US DOT specific. But so there's that whole thing thinking about it. Access is power, so if you have access to information, that is powerful, or people who have access or not. And then gatekeeping through economics and prestige. That is transportation academic research in a nutshell. And this is something that I'm sure a lot of grad students hopefully haven't had to encounter this that much, but after you graduate, especially if you're a master's student, you're gonna go work for a consulting agency after this or something, you're not gonna have access to a lot of journals afterwards. But that's okay. If you ever need help getting a journal article, feel free to email me. That is my job. So when you're doing your research also, as you start to ask questions, I think it's always good to think about which jurisdictions are involved, because that will tell you some places to look. Which communities are affected, that will also tell you like areas to look. What is the role of the private sector? That will tell you maybe where to look, but also to understand what some of the issues might be in accessing stuff, because sometimes if it's really reliant on the private sector, you might not get all the reports. You know that there's stuff sitting out there in some consultant's laptop that like, or the DOT has it, but they can't share it because of some sort of embargo. That's a problem. How long has the project been in the works? Because sometimes like there's projects that you're like, oh yeah, they've been working on that for like a decade and we haven't seen any sign of like any progress. It's like, well then is that actually gonna happen? And then are there any completed projects that are related to it? Because that might sort of give you breadcrumbs to the past or breadcrumbs to what the future might be. Okay, so here are the tools. Now we're actually getting to the practical part. Sorry. I feel like this is all kind of practical, but maybe not. So tools, this is actually, the picture there is the transfer ITS library back in the, I think, late 60s before we moved to our current site. At the Richmond Field Station, where the UCPRC is now, has offices. So one thing is you should be using databases and catalogs for academic literature. Search engines are really good for agency documents. Databases and different websites can be good for news articles, and I think news articles can be really good to sort of find out about things that are happening or didn't happen a lot of times because there wasn't a report about it. And then data are everywhere. And that's something that I think is, but there's a lot of information out there. Be prepared to be overwhelmed, especially like now. It seems like every day there's a new journal that pops up out of nowhere. And some of them are good, but a lot of them I don't think are necessary. And I ask like, who asked for this? Nobody, but people need to publish. So there we are. So this is like the most practical thing. How many of you are familiar with TRID? I am so happy. If you're not familiar with TRID,
should be higher.
this is a great database. This is the transportation research database from TRB. It has academic articles, it has conference papers, it has government reports. All the UTC reports go there. University research goes there. It has white papers from different NGOs. It's international in scope. It goes back. So when I said the Highway Research Information Service, HRIS, that was started back from TRB or HRB, back with the Highway Research Board in 1930, this is what it is today. That was the foundation of that. So you will find some gnarly, weird vestigial records from the 50s that you're like, can't really figure this out. But a lot of it you can then go take the information from TRID and go look in that catalog to find it. It's international in scope, so it does actually have research from around the world. It is, I think, a great place to start. If you were starting any transportation research question, I would start at TRID first, just to get a sense. It's not the place, you should not do all your research there, or maybe you can, if it's like, oh my gosh, this topic has like 2,500 papers. You know, to me, that says like, maybe you should figure out how to refine your topic to be something that's like, well, not so obvious. Or it could be like, oh, I'm not using the correct terminology so much, or like, this will sort of help you figure out in the transportation way that's like not too overwhelming. I really love TRID. So this is like the best database for here. I have to say that though, because like, there's also catalogs like UC Library Search. This is the Davis version. There's a catalog for all 10 UC campuses in one. So if you search in UC Library Search, you will get articles and databases. TRID is not in there. It does index other databases like JSTOR and Web-based Science, and ProQuest. There's a lot of different databases. Unfortunately, TRID is not capable of being indexed by those, by Primo, the platform that we use. So it would cost way too much money to do that. So alas, TRID's not there. But it's another good place to start. And if you find stuff in the physical collection, you can request it. These attend the UC libraries. So if there's a book that we have at Berkeley that you want, you can request it through UC Library Search, and it will show up at whatever library you want. Probably Shields, I guess. Yeah, it's really great. You'll probably need to use your campus ID to log into it though, to access all of the resources. And I'm also assuming, hopefully you all know how to use the proxy or VPN to access things off campus. Great, because that's really important. Google Scholar, how many people use Google Scholar? Great. I think I use Google Scholar all the time. I think it's really good if you're looking for a known citation. Like if you're like, oh yeah, someone mentioned this paper, let me look it up in Google Scholar. That can be often the fastest way to get to it. Using Google Scholar is better a lot of times too than using Google to do that, because if you search regular Google, it'll take you to some probably other citations, or you won't actually get access to the paper. It has everything. The problem though is Google Scholar is a black box. They will change the algorithm and not tell anyone about it. And all of a sudden you're like, why are my results kind of weird? Like 6 months ago, they were prioritizing high school papers. And I was doing searches and I kept getting high school papers, and someone else finally complained about it on Blue Sky. And I was like, wait, I thought I was hallucinating, or my searches were bad or something. And it's like, but then they re-indexed it and everything has gone back to normal. But if you ever find weird results in Google Scholar, there's a good chance they did something on the back end. They also do a lot of weird conflating, or sometimes they have a hard time figuring out like what is a publication. And you'll find like lots of versions of the same publication, but Google Scholar will say like, oh, there's like 5 different versions, and then they'll actually have different results for that. And you're like, it's not the same thing. But the other thing is like, if you're not really sure what it is, so sometimes it's great if you're like, I have an idea of who's publishing it, and you can get a very multidisciplinary view. The other problem though is like, you might get a lot of false hits, or you'll just get an overwhelming number of responses, especially in transportation where there's a lot of overlap in terminology with biology or computer processing. So you'll hear like, traffic stuff, and you're like, oh, they're talking about packets and like information processing. They're not talking about, people moving in vehicles, or they're talking about blood transport, and they're not talking about, public transport. So that's the thing to watch for. The other thing that I'm very into right now that I think you should be aware of is the Wayback Machine. So this is from the Internet Archive. Especially if you're dealing with stuff from government reports and you have broken links, the Wayback Machine might be able to resurrect it for you. It'll have a cached copy. And so it's, you just you paste in the URL and it'll tell you if it's been indexed, and when the last time it's been indexed, and you can see snapshots over time. It can be really cool if you're doing something, you're like, what were they talking about this? Like, what did this website look like 10 years ago? And yeah, it's also really important right now as a lot of with the transition between administrations and the federal government. there was a whole team of people that was archiving the previous administration stuff to try to make sure, and this happens between any term, like you wanna make sure that we have the snapshot from just before. To make sure we don't lose stuff, and so with that machine, we do that. But also, as I mentioned, link rot earlier, like, that's a really good one for like, every time Caltrans changes its website, all the links break. You can go back usually to the Wayback Machine. And so, which is, all I think is really important to recognize that everything is extremely brittle right now. Like, I know I say this like maybe because I'm a librarian who works for a research institute, but like, things are not okay. And I like had this moment earlier this year where I was like, how come I'm not as productive as I should be? And I'm like, oh wait, all my tools are breaking. You know, databases that I thought were gonna exist were being taken offline and then brought back online, and now it's like that trust is gone. And I think that just shows that we realize so many of our information sources rely on the federal government in the US. And that's the ecosystem that we've grown into. But now that's starting to, you know, become on board, and we're like, well, what's happening? And so we're watching everything unravel slowly in different ways, and so that's gonna create a lot more broken links and more, you know, questions of like, what happened to that report? I think people are really trying hard to catalog and archive as much as possible, and thankfully we have done a pretty good job going forward, so I don't think it's as bad. But you are still gonna find, like, have those moments where like, I knew this thing existed and I can't find evidence of it. And I don't think we can avoid that. But I think it's also important to recognize libraries are really precarious right now too, in general. Because a lot of the libraries that were doing these functions, like, have also lost funding. And so we're doing the best we can. That's one thing that I know I was trying to carry out over lunch, or one of the things about VC funding, like, so libraries, as VC budgets have increased over the decades, because enrollment has increased, the library budgets have not kept up with that, because every time the state increases money, it's always to instruction and not libraries. Even though we pay, our subscriptions are per capita, so the increase in students is also causing the subscription prices to go up, as well as the fact that the publishers always keep raising prices anyway. So it's like, it's really, really hard. And so I know some campuses are making really hard decisions. Right now, Davis, I think, is okay. You should have access to everything, but if you don't email me, I can get you copies. And then I think be aware of link rot. As I said, broken links, but also AI is causing a huge issue with research, and it's causing an issue in twofold. How many people use ChatGPT to do research? It's okay. How many people like, so the problem I've noticed is, because I've been trying out ChatGPT, and Perplexity is another one. Site, I think there are a couple of these, like, there are all these different AI search tools. The problem is, one, if they're getting bad garbage information in, then they're gonna give you garbage information back. And we keep hearing stories, like there was another story recently, like yesterday or today, of some lawyer who had a hallucinated citation that they put in, they got caught by a judge and they're being fined $31,000. And some lawyers are like, you gotta like, you know, this person should be disbarred, that's malpractice. But other lawyers are like, well, you should at least double check your citations. And like, we're at this weird point now where I think no one really knows the right answer, but I think it is important to recognize hallucinations happen, and you might not recognize it because you aren't familiar with the topic area, but you should assume that they're happening. And so like, using AI can be useful, but you have to validate and check things, in which case maybe it would be less than intensive to actually just do the searching yourself. The flip side of that, though, is also more slop content out there that's just like AI generated like content mill stuff. That's gonna start showing up in search results too. So you have to be able to go through like, is this actually real? Like there are these weird AI generated journals that are just content mills. There's no actual work behind it, but you look at it, it looks just like a journal. So just watch out there. There's not, it keeps getting everything, just when we think we solve one problem, a new problem emerges and you're like, okay. So yeah, so forging ahead, think about how your work fits with other disciplines and be open to that. I think that will also help your search strategy of thinking about different ways to find stuff, especially if you are hitting dead ends. Like, I think it's really important to think about who else might be asking this question and how would they be asking it, and so maybe they will have the answer that I'm looking for. How your work fits in history, I think can help with terminology, especially if you have to look backwards, because it can be really hard. And I feel like engineering is starting to open up again to looking historically. I think there was like a moment 5 years ago where like, we don't need old books. But, you know, at the same time, like, there's some state law, like, forget the bill, but the one that allows cities to reduce speed limits and not into the 85th percentile. Part of that was because we looked back and was like, where was the research? How did they come up with the 85th percentile? It was just vibes, basically. There's Miller McClintock. And think about how you can make your work accessible to others. So some of this is like, I know there's a big push to have policy briefs, to make a digestible form to the public, but also publishing open access. You have the tools to do that for free. So, and the last thing before I'm done, how many of you use Zotero? Okay, great. If you haven't used Zotero yet, you should really it's great. It's free. It's my favorite piece of software in the world. It's good for citation management. It's good for, it handles a whole sorts of variety of things. You archive web pages, get snapshots. You'll be really happy you did when it actually comes time to write and stuff. So please use Zotero. And that's it.
What's your favorite transportation related book?
My favorite transportation related book. I will say the one that really changed my perspective the most was Donald Shute's High Cost of Free Parking. I read it when it first came out, and yeah, it kind of broke me a little bit. I don't know if you've read it.
No, I'm familiar with the work, but not how much.
I mean, the book is really good. I also don't feel like Shute has, there's the whole cult of Shute now, which has sprung forth from the book, so maybe you don't really need to read it, but, at the same time, though,
Pretty thick book.
What?
It's a pretty thick book.
yeah, no, and then the second edition, like, they added even more to it. But yeah, no, I think that might be one of my favorite transportation books.
You talked about the last part was historical in nature about, I can't remember what it was now, but have you read Wes Marshall's book yet?
Oh, yeah.
Killed by a Traffic Engineer. He's our next speaker. Several of you guys are reading the book so that we can grill him about his own work.
That's another.
It's really a history book.
It is. It's interesting because, I feel like that, and I think that's one of the interesting things to see, like that book in particular, but I know Peter Norton's been, I think, also doing a good job of sort of like, I think it's always good to critically think about like, why are the assumptions we have now, like, they didn't just happen out of a vacuum, or like, they didn't just spring forth out of thin air, like, choices led us to this, and I think Wes Marshall's book, I know, like, it was really great reading it, but then also seeing the backlash of some of the critiques from it. And it's like, I think it's causing engineers to reflect on themselves. And I know, like, some of the critiques were like, he's not really an engineer, practicing engineer anymore. Cause I was on the ITE listserv, like, went crazy. I know if you all are ITE members, they had a lot of problems with it. But I think some of it is because it's like, you have to be self-critical, and it's hard to be self-critical. And I think a lot of professions don't give themselves the space to be self-critical, to think about it. And maybe I think that like in libraries, like we're just like spent so much time, like I always feel like I always have to question myself and my true to my professional ethics. So I think that again, like part of this, like this talk was very much like, oh, this is how I approach research. It's really based off of pulling in all this information and this worldview, which makes searching, like, hopefully it makes it a little bit easier to think about rather than just like, I'm looking for, a term about bus stops. Because a lot of times, like, when people come to me with questions and if you ever reach out to me for research support, which I hope you do, be prepared. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, like, just tell me about your project. Because a lot of times when you come with a question, the real question you have is not the one you're saying out loud. Or you're like, I just want articles about this topic. It's like, well, we need to talk about that because maybe the topic you're actually interested in is not the thing you think you are, or the answers are not going to be there. So but it's hard to find a space to have that conversation with people, or even with yourself.
It's just gonna be you and her.
I've always been a little bit confused about the relationship between, like preprints being accessible and then, but somehow it gets behind the paywall. And so the things you shared about that was really interesting, but I guess as someone, you know, going into an academic, I've always been kind of confused about how someone can just give you an access, like, to a copy of their paper if you email them, but then if you don't, then you have to go ahead, like, kind of, can you talk more about the history of that?
Yeah, so, well, yeah, so part of it is, some of it goes down to like the agreements you sign when you're an author with the publisher. Most authors historically, and to this day, still sign away their copyright. And so they're giving the publisher exclusive copyright, like it's the exclusive license to publish their work. The UC system has, it was like 2013 for faculty and then 2015 for all students and staff, has an open access preprints. It's not an agreement, it's a mandate. And most publishers actually recognize that and honor it, because they don't want to mess with UC in that regard. And so that means, but the thing that's confusing is you have the right to publish the final author manuscript version in eScholarship for free without paying for an APC. And that means like, so it's after it's gone through peer review, but before it does the final like editing to make it look nice.
Okay.
So like the content should be the same, but it just won't look the same necessarily. You can put that in eScholarship for free. And that's actually what eScholarship was designed for. Was for that purpose. And so that's acceptable. And I think a lot of publishers kind of understand that. But the problem is you want to make sure you do it after it's been accepted for publication.
Right.
Because if you do it beforehand, you might get rejected for self-plagiarism. Except, this is the thing that's like really, and it's funny because I've been going through and doing bibliography or collecting, creating this big bibliography of some of our faculty. You'll see like back in there's a Wild West time in like the 80s and 90s where people were pushing out working papers and then it would be published as a journal article like 3 years later. And I think the working papers were more of like a line in the sand, like I'm getting this out there. And then they would refine it to get the journal article, but they still had like credit first. That won't fly anymore. And like, I know we've seen this with some professors who would been caught for self-plagiarism because they would turn in a report for Caltrans and then they would turn into a journal. And then the journal was like, no, you can't publish that. It's already been that. But their whole career, they spent 20 years doing that and it was fine until now. And so I think, so that's why if you're gonna do the preprint route, I always say wait until it's actually been published, and so then you can actually do the DOI and all that stuff on it, so it's very clear, it's the preprint of this other article, or say it's a preprint explicitly on it, so then some journals are fine accepting it, as long as you say it's a preprint. The other side of that though, is a lot of people are now starting to publish preprints and not actually submit them to journal articles, where you're starting to see, and this existed before COVID, but it really took off during COVID and is still going on, where people are doing that. But then they don't go through peer review, and so you don't have this like, some of this stuff being published as preprints, even from people who are normally pretty good, like, you can tell peer review does have a function, and some of it's kind of junky and like not really validated, and so there's that whole mess. Yeah.
So I was just wondering why that change happened, and if you think it's actually useful or good, or if the old way was fine.
Preprints?
Or, not getting on people's case about self-plagiarism when it's just a different form of the same data, but presented in a different way for a different audience.
Well, I think that presenting the data or presenting the research in different ways for different audiences is actually good. This is something I've argued with some of the research managers with UCITS about. Like, there's this whole thing like, do I have to write a research report if I'm also writing a journal article? And I'm like, well, who's the intended audience of that journal article? If you actually write a 10-page, because journal articles tend to be about 10 pages, maybe 20 pages at most, but like they tend not to be super long. But the audience is academic, so you're gonna go more into methodology. And the analysis is gonna be different than if you're doing a tech report or like a you know, some sort of report for an agency where you're like, you know, here's the methodology, here's all the work that we did, here are all the results, and it's gonna be detailed in a way that's more like, here's all the work we did, prove that we did all the work. That's gonna be different, like that's, and so they could be different reports, but at the same time, who has time to write 2 reports? And so I think, it could be fine. The problem, I have no problem with self-plagiarism, and I think that some of this goes down to like having informed authors around like, you know, the journal shouldn't be mad that it was out of the Caltrans. Part of the reason that their journals are mad is because they want to have that primacy so that they get the money and justify the subscription costs, which is not really useful for the public. But then at the same time, it's one of those things like, I think it's important for academic researchers, especially faculty, to understand their role in the system. And it's like, you know, if you have to publish in academic journals, then you're gonna have to figure out a way to do both. Or like, and I think that that's the tension too, is like research funding now, especially now, but even before what's started like going on, like always has strings attached. And the funder has terms and you have to agree to those terms and you accept the money. The library, like my side is a librarian, I just see it all playing out in publications.
So I think, given the time, I'm gonna cut things off there. Can we thank Kendra?